Ergativity for Novices, Part 2.2. This video is an adaptation of a thread called Ergativity for Novices on the ZBB written by Bradron, who kindly permitted me to reproduce it in this form. I have edited and trimmed it, but it remains mostly the same. You can find the links to Part 0, the introduction, Part 1, Morphological Ergativity, and Part 2.1, the previous section on split ergativity, in the description below, which I highly recommend looking at before this one because it goes over certain terminology we'll be using. This section is the second part of split ergativity. So far, we have covered one type of split ergativity, splits by the nature of the verb. In those splits, the S argument is grouped with either A or O depending on the choice of verb. However, there are several other types of split attested in the languages of the world. Here we will cover splits based on the nature of the noun phrase, another very common type of split. The animacy hierarchy. For splits on the nature of noun phrases, the key observation to make is that certain noun phrases are more likely to be agents, whereas other noun phrases are more likely to be patients. For instance, the first person pronoun I is more likely to be an agent. For example, in the phrase, I moved, it's likely that I'm in control. Whereas an inanimate noun like the box is likely to be a patient. For example, in the phrase, the box moved, it's likely that the box was moved by someone else rather than deciding to move of its own volition. We might also note that for some verbs, the agent noun phrase is usually human, such as for the verbs believe and decide, while for other verbs, the agent noun phrase is usually human or animate, like the verbs see, bite, and run. But there are almost zero verbs which are restricted to only inanimate noun phrases. The opposite is true for object noun phrases. Some verbs can have any object, like to see, while some verbs usually have an inanimate object, like pick up or throw, though there do exist verbs which preferentially have a human or animate object, such as spear or hunt, but they are less common than the other types of verb. If we combine all these observations, we end up with a list of types of noun phrases, where noun phrases on the left are more likely to be agents, and noun phrases on the right are more likely to be objects. First person, then second person, then third person and demonstratives, then proper nouns, then humans, then animate nouns, and lastly inanimate nouns. This is known as the animacy hierarchy, or nominal hierarchy, but I will be using the former term. It is easy to relate this hierarchy to split ergativity. Noun phrases on the left are prototypically agents, so they should have an unmarked A role, that is, a nominative-accusative system, while noun phrases on the right are prototypically objects, so they should have an unmarked O role, that is, an ergative-absolutive system. We might think of accusative marking extending in from the left-hand side, and ergative marking extending in from the right-hand side. The simplest animacy-based split would have them meeting at some point in the middle, but there do exist more complex systems which will be covered later. Of course, as with most topics in linguistics, there is some variation in the animacy hierarchy between languages. For instance, this hierarchy here shows demonstratives to the left of proper nouns, but occasionally we get personal names to the left of demonstratives. Some Algonquian languages famously have second persons above first persons rather than the opposite, although see Will Oxford's paper Algonquian Grammar Myths for a much more detailed view and partial refutation of this. There are also rare exceptions to the rule that accusative marking is used on the left of the hierarchy while ergative marking is used on the right. For instance, arrente has an ergative paradigm in the first person pronoun, but an accusative paradigm in the other pronouns, while the Samoyedic language Nganasan has an accusative pattern in its nouns but no case marking in its pronouns, which could be considered a rare example of a split accusative system. Suya has a particularly clear example of this. In future and negative clauses, pronouns use an ergative paradigm, but common nouns use an accusative paradigm. We have already seen that active-stative systems, split S and fluid S from the previous video, must often manifest their ergativity through verbal agreement rather than case marking, as those varieties of split ergativity depend on the nature of the verb. Similarly, animacy-based split ergative systems most often manifest their ergativity through case marking, as this variety of split ergativity depends on the nature of the noun. However, this is certainly not universal. Dixon lists Chukchi, Coast Salish, and Chinook as having an animacy-based split system using verbal agreement. When animacy-based systems do use case marking, they most commonly use three case markers. The nominative and absolutive cases are usually unmarked, making them syncretic as a side effect, as is usual for those cases, while the ergative and accusative cases each get their own case markers. For instance, in Diable, the nominative and accusative cases are both null. The ergative is ngu, and the accusative case is na. Of course, languages can diverge from this model, especially in more complex splits such as those I'll outline later. But from a conlanging perspective, this sort of system is a good place to start. A final interesting point about these sort of animacy-based splits is their interaction with case concord. In some languages, modifiers such as adjectives and relative clauses exhibit case concord, that is, they agree in case with the modified noun. However, if the modifier and head are on opposite sides of the animacy split, then they can disagree in case even though case concord applies. For instance, in the following Diable sentence, the A argument is a pronoun which has a nominative-accusative alignment and thus gets nominative marking as it is an A argument. But the adjective modifying it has ergative-absolutive alignment and thus gets ergative marking. Nginda wuigingu bamiran babi. Given that noun phrases at the left of the animacy hierarchy are more likely to be agents, and noun phrases at the right are more likely to be patients, one could imagine a system where the A and O noun phrases are determined purely by their relative positions on the animacy hierarchy. Such systems do exist and are known as direct inverse systems due to their unique set of verb affixes. When the direct affix is used, A is the noun phrase which is higher on the animacy hierarchy, and O is the noun phrase which is lower on the animacy hierarchy. But when the inverse affix is used, A is the noun phrase which is lower on the animacy hierarchy, and O is the noun phrase which is higher on the animacy hierarchy. For instance, first person singular, second person singular, see direct would mean I see you, because the first person sits above the second person in the animacy hierarchy, whereas first person singular, second person singular, see inverted would mean you see me. Direct inverse systems are fascinating, but they aren't really split ergative systems as such, so I won't go into detail about them. Splits on the animacy hierarchy. Earlier, we mentioned one example of a split using the animacy hierarchy. This shows a split between third-person pronouns and demonstratives and proper nouns. The result is that pronouns can get accusative marking while nouns get ergative marking. This system is used in many languages, for example Diable. However, there are other possible splits. For example, another common place to have a split is between first and second person pronouns and all other nouns, as in this diagram. Other locations for splits seem to be rarer, but do exist. Most notably, Hittite had a split between accusative marking for all pronouns, humans and animates, but used ergative marking for all neuter nouns, which, of course, are mostly inanimate. Possibly, the rarity of other split locations is due to the fact that it is rare for a language to have such a simple and clean split between accusative and ergative marking. Most animacy-based splits tend to have at least a little more complexity, and these more complex languages often do show splits at other points. Now, these systems are pretty simple, but there certainly exist more complex ones. We know that accusativity extends in from the left of the hierarchy, while ergativity extends in from the right. But there's no reason why those paradigms have to meet at the same point. Thus, it is relatively common to get systems like this one from Kashinawa. Here, first and second person pronouns get accusative marking, while proper and common nouns get ergative marking. However, the two systems overlap at the third person, giving it tripartite marking. The idea of accusative marking plus ergative marking giving tripartite marking is borne out by the nature of the case marking. The first and second pronouns mark accusative case with an a suffix, nouns mark ergative case via nasalization of the final vowel, and the s-a-o forms of the third person pronoun are habu, habun, and ha, respectively. Although I said previously that Diable has a split between accusative marking for pronouns but ergative marking for nouns, there is in fact one place where it has tripartite marking, this being for the human interrogative form wanya. This is precisely in accord with what the animacy hierarchy predicts. Additionally, proper names can take optional tripartite marking, as will be described later for yidin. But there do exist languages with a completely exclusive split between accusative and ergative paradigms with no overlap. For instance, kuku yalanji, and nyamba. A similar but more complex system is found in Yidin. This system is interesting in that the accusative marking seems to fade out towards the right of the hierarchy. This system goes from accusative marking for first and second person pronouns to tripartite marking for human deictics and the human interrogative and indefinite who or someone, to tripartite marking with accusative marking optional for inanimate deictics and proper names, i.e., O can be marked either by the unmarked S form or with the accusative case, to fully ergative marking for everything else. We will discuss similar systems more fully later in the section on differential case marking. The Wagga Wagga language has another unusual variation with tripartite marking at the left and middle of the hierarchy and ergative marking at the right, but no purely accusative marking anywhere. Similarly to how accusative and ergative marking overlap to get tripartite marking, we might expect the opposite variety of a system to be attested as well, with accusative and ergative marking never meeting and direct marking instead of tripartite marking in the center. But I can't find an example of such a system, although admittedly I haven't looked very hard. On the other hand, this sort of system can be used to explain situations such as that found in many Indo-European languages, where masculine and feminine nouns and pronouns have distinct nominative and accusative forms, but neuter or inanimate nouns have no case marking. Here, there is accusative marking extending in from the left, but no ergative marking on the right. There are also a few other factors which can influence more complex splits. Of these, the most prominent is number. For instance, Arabana shows a system in which non-singular pronouns take accusative marking, singular pronouns and proper nouns take tripartite marking, and common nouns take ergative marking. At first this would seem like a straightforward extension of the animacy hierarchy if we put plurals to the left of pronouns. However, Dixon suggests that it is invalid to place non-singular nouns on the animacy hierarchy, and that such systems are simply a result of the general typological principle that more morphological distinctions are made in the singular than in the plural. Semantically, not placing non-singular nouns on the animacy hierarchy makes sense. Plurals are no more or less animate than singulars, and thus cannot readily be placed on the animacy hierarchy. This is supported by systems such as that of Kalau Lagau Ya from the Torres Straits in Australia. This system uses tripartite marking for singular pronouns, direct marking for dual pronouns, accusative marking for singular and dual names, ergative marking for common nouns, and direct marking for all plurals. Of course, the earlier comment about the general typological principle of the plural having less distinctions than singular is only a generalization. For instance, the Gumbangir language uses ergative alignment for first-person dual and second-person singular, but tripartite alignment for first-person singular and plural, and second-person dual and plural. Similarly, Imas uses accusative alignment for first-person dual, but tripartite alignment for first-person singular and plural. Besides number, another factor which can influence a split is definiteness. Generally, the further left a noun phrase is on the animacy hierarchy, the more likely it is to be definite. Pronouns and demonstratives are always definite, humans are usually definite, and inanimate noun phrases are usually indefinite. Due to this, definite noun phrases are usually associated with animacy and accusative alignment, while indefinite noun phrases are associated with inanimacy and ergative alignment. Although the correlation of definiteness with animacy seems to be well known, there appear to be few languages which use it as a component of an animacy-based split. However, it seems that definiteness is often a component of splits involving differential case marking. Wait until a bit later on for more details on differential case marking. Finally, remember that all these tendencies related to the animacy hierarchy, number, and definiteness are just generalizations. For instance, DR uses a complex split between ergative, tripartite, and accusative alignments, where ergative alignment is used for male personal names and singular common nouns. Tripartite alignment is used for female personal names, non-singular common nouns, singular first and second person pronouns, and all third person pronouns, and accusative alignment is used for non-singular first and second person pronouns. I suppose the lesson here is that although the majority of languages work according to the animacy hierarchy and similar concepts, a split system can be arbitrarily complex, within reasonable limits, of course. Bound-free splits. Earlier I mentioned that agreement and case marking generally occur together only in specific ways. In particular, there is a universal. If a language has accusative case marking, then it cannot have any form of ergative verbal agreement. At the time I had stated that, however, a fuller discussion of the theory behind why the universal is true will have to wait until split ergativity and the animacy hierarchy are discussed later. The discussion thus far is probably sufficient for now. But now that we know about these concepts, we can explain this universal. The explanation relies on diachronics. Consider a language with an animacy-based split between accusative pronouns and ergative nouns. Now, it is fairly common for pronouns to cliticize onto the verb, and thence develop into agreement affixes. Of course, since the pronouns in this system follow an accusative pattern, the agreement affixes should also follow an accusative pattern, by using one set for S and A arguments and another set for O arguments. But now, let's say the noun phrase case system undergoes leveling. The ergative case system used with nouns is generalized to pronouns as well. However, by this point the agreement system is now fully grammaticalized and separate from the noun case system, which means that it is still accusative. So we get an accusative agreement system with an ergative noun case system. On the other hand, to get a split the other way around, ergative agreement with accusative case, a language would need to start with an animacy-based split with ergative for pronouns and accusative for nouns. But this split would be the wrong way round, so to speak, which is why such a system is never seen. That process of evolution is pretty much what happened in Warlpiri to get ergative case marking and accusative agreement in that language. But there's several other languages like this. The Papuan language Gahuku, which has SA agreement prefixes and O agreement suffixes, but an ergative case marking system. I think it's likely that they underwent a similar process. For instance, possibly another source could be word order. If an ergative language with SV-AVO word order had its pronouns cliticize onto a verb, it could get agreement prefixes and suffixes similar to those from Gahuku. I'm sure that there are numerous other processes which could yield a similar split, but for now I'll focus on the animacy-based process as seen in Warlpiri. So, to summarize, in a language with an animacy-based split, pronouns are generally accusative in a largely accusative case-marking system, and agreement markers can derive from pronouns, so accusative agreement can co-occur with ergative case, but not the other way around. Differential case marking. Occasionally, split ergative systems show differential case marking. This refers to a situation where an argument is marked in two or more different ways depending on the situation. In particular, there are two relatively common variations of differential case marking which occur in split ergative systems: optional ergative marking and differential ergative marking. Note, differential case marking isn't particularly closely related to animacy at all, but it is common to have ergative languages which have differential case systems distributed according to the animacy hierarchy, so I will include it in this section here for lack of a better place to put it. Optional ergative marking refers to a situation in which the ergative case may or may not be marked. For instance, consider the following two sentences from Lhasa Tibetan. Both of these sentences have the basic meaning, he prepares the meals, but are different in connotation. Number one is a neutral statement, as would be used to answer a question, what does he do? While number two places contrastive evidence, as Tornado calls it, on the fact that it is him who prepares the meals, as opposed to, say, Lobsang who serves the food. Optional ergative marking is fairly common. McGregor reports that it is found in more than 100 languages worldwide. As always, the extent of optional ergative marking varies. In some languages, like Warrawa and Gunyandi, it can occur in any environment, whereas in other languages it is found only in some environments. Frequently, this restriction is animacy-based. On the animacy hierarchy, optional ergative marking is usually found to the left of obligatory ergative marking, but to the right of any region of absent ergative marking if it exists. For example, Umpitamu shows obligatory ergative marking for inanimate noun phrases, but optional ergative marking for all other noun phrases. Aduga has a similar but more complex split. Obligatory marking is used for most nouns, some proper names and pronouns, neutral marking is used for first and second person pronouns, and optional ergative marking is used for noun phrases which are between those regions on the animacy hierarchy. i.e. for some proper names and the animate interrogative who or what. And even in languages like Gunyandi, with optional ergative marking everywhere, it is more common to omit the ergative on more animate noun phrases. And as with everything else, there are always exceptions. For example, Yugambe Bunjalong has obligatory ergative marking for pronouns, optional ergative marking on human nouns and nouns for large animals, and no ergative marking on inanimates and lower order animates. As outlined earlier for Tibetan, there is certainly some motivation for the presence or absence of the ergative marker in a language with optional ergative marking. However, exactly what this motivation is seems to be hard to pin down, and several different explanations have been proposed. One explanation is that the ergative is more likely to be marked when focusing on the agent, or when emphasizing the agency, volition, or willfulness of the agent. The absence of ergative can have various meanings depending on the language, including a neutral interpretation, topic continuity, or downplaying individual will. This seems to be the case for Lhasa Tibetan, and in the language Mongsen Ao, according to McGregor, the unmarked ergative has the interesting implication of designating an agent acting in accordance with social expectations, and gives the example of chickens, non-ergative, eating paddy, which they've been fed, versus chickens, ergative, eating paddy, which they are stealing. This sort of distinction can have a pragmatic function by designating a focus or topic, or a semantic function by marking agentivity, similar to fluid S systems. On the other hand, there are languages in which it is an absence of ergative marking which is meaningful, whereas the presence of ergative marking is neutral. Generally, the absence of ergative marking downplays agency or backgrounds the agent. As mentioned earlier, another relatively common form of differential case marking in ergative languages is differential ergative marking. This is a situation in which a language has two or more distinct markers for ergative case. Note that these are separate markers rather than simply two allomorphs of the same marker. The latter is common and unremarkable, whereas the former is much rarer. Unlike optional ergative marking, differential case marking can have a variety of semantic meanings. For instance, in Warwa, one ergative marker, na, ma, is neutral in meaning, whereas the other marker, ma, is a focal ergative marker that accords contrastive information focus to the agent and or focalizes its agency. Both ergative markers can be used for any noun phrase. Similar notions of focus and control are used in Kaluli. Kukuyalanji also has two ergative markers, really two sets of allomorphs determined by vowel harmony. Pronouns, human nouns, and the human interrogative who can only take the ergative marker unku, and the inanimate interrogative what and nouns denoting plants and tools can only take the other ergative marker, bu, nya, or de. Nouns which are intermediate on the animacy hierarchy between these sets can take either ergative marker. Use of the former indicates agentivity, volition, and independence, whereas use of the latter marker is neutral. In Wajari, one ergative marker, lu, is normally used with proper nouns, while another, nku, is used with common nouns. But the speaker can use lu with common nouns to give the connotation that they are personally involved in the event, or the event is particularly relevant to them, or to show deference. McGregor gives the example of using lu to indicate that the event involves the speaker's spouse rather than just any woman. Sahaptin is tripartite rather than ergative, but its ergative marker also shows a differential system. The two ergative case markers, in and ni or have an unusual distribution reminiscent of an Algonquian direct inverse system. In is used when O is third person, whereas ni or is used when O is first or second person. It is clear from this list that differential ergative marking shows a greater variety of implications and distributions than optional ergative marking, which on the whole is generally restricted to a specific meaning, focusing or backgrounding the agent or its agentivity, and a specific distribution on the animacy hierarchy between absent ergative marking and obligatory ergative marking. However, there are certainly some general tendencies which can be seen here. For instance, there is a tendency for one ergative marker to be used on one part of the animacy hierarchy, while another ergative marker is used on another part of the animacy hierarchy. Additionally, one ergative marker usually has a more neutral meaning, while the other encompasses or emphasizes the agent and its agentivity. Finally, I will note that these forms of differential case marking are not mutually exclusive. In fact, it is possible for both to occur in the same language. For instance, warwa has both optional and differential ergative marking. And that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful. Next time we'll be looking at splits according to tense, aspect, and mood. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't like and don't subscribe.